In the fall of 1714, 42 settlers from the Carolina coast disappeared without a single trace. They weren't ransomed, they weren't sold, they weren't slaughtered in raids. They simply vanished. And every witness who saw what happened remembered the same chilling detail. The pirate captain who took them didn't care about their gold, their silver, or even their ships. Instead, he chose them one by one, the way a farmer inspects livestock at market, checking their teeth, listening to their breath, testing their reflexes with the cold precision of a surgeon. His name was Captain Ezekiel Thorne, and according to records hidden for centuries in Charleston's archives, he wasn't an ordinary pirate at all. Court documents from his naval service describe a brilliant surgeon who once saved hundreds of lives during Britain's Caribbean campaigns. Medical journals in Portsmouth praised his skill and even called his survival rates near supernatural. But somewhere in the fever-ridden waters of the Spanish Main, this healer became something else entirely. For more than 300 years, the fate of those 42 souls was one of America's most enduring maritime mysteries. Officials buried the investigation, told families their loved ones had drowned, and sealed the truth beneath layers of lies and secrecy. Now, newly uncovered shipwreck evidence in Cuban waters, decoded manuscripts from Spanish monasteries, and declassified British naval files finally reveal the horrifying truth. Before we dive deeper into the story of Captain Thorne and his unholy experiments, I want you to know this channel is devoted to the darkest, most unsettling stories from American history. The ones textbooks gloss over or deliberately conceal. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what state you're listening from. I love seeing where my fellow mystery hunters are, and it helps me know which regional stories connect most with you. So what really happened to those 42 people? And why does their disappearance remain one of the most disturbing episodes in early American history? The records we're about to explore come from 3 different nations, dozens of archives, and even physical evidence that somehow survived the centuries. Together, they paint a picture so dark, it forces us to rethink everything we believed about piracy medicine and the human cost of scientific ambition in the 18th century. The Carolina coast in 1714 was a dangerous borderland where European settlers were still fighting to carve out survival. Only 4 years had passed since Carolina became a royal colony, and its coastline stretched for hundreds of miles, treacherous waters lined with fragile settlements. Colonists faced constant threats. Spanish raiders sweeping up from Florida Creek and Cherokee war parties striking from inland, and pirates who slipped in and out of hidden coves. Charlestown now. Charleston was the only truly fortified community home to around 3,000 people. Beyond its walls lay scattered farms, rice plantations carved from swampy ground lumber camps, where men felled giant cypress trees for the king's ships, fishing villages scraping by from the sea, and trading posts bartering with native tribes. It was a harsh, unforgiving land that demanded resilience. Families like the Petenstons built a sawmill on the Ashley River, relying on Thomas's naval carpentry skills to cut timbers for ships, while his wife Margaret raised 3 children after losing 2 others to the fevers that haunted the colony. Or women like Rebecca Hartwell, a widowed trader in her 30s who had arrived as a tobacco planter's bride only to lose her husband to yellow fever. Rather than return to England, she used her small inheritance to open a post and teach children to read the rare literate woman on the frontier. These weren't the wealthy rice barons who would later dominate Carolina society. They were working families, survivors, and dreamers. And in 1714, they became the chosen subjects of a pirate surgeon whose experiments would echo across centuries of whispered rumor and buried truth. These were working families, people who owned little more than a few cleared acres, some tools, and the desperate hope that hard labor might one day bring security for their children. They lived in rough wooden houses with oiled paper windows, wore homespun clothes, and considered themselves lucky if they ate meat more than twice a week. On top of this hard life, the political climate kept everyone on edge. Queen Anne's War had just ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, but peace was fragile and the colonies were filled with restless men. Thousands of sailors and soldiers, hardened by years of fighting, now found themselves jobless and unwanted. Many turned to piracy, believing it the only path left in a world that had discarded them. The colonial government was in no position to stop them. Charlestown barely kept order within its own walls, and Governor Charles Craven commanded fewer than 50 regular soldiers, relying on poorly trained militia and a single-armed sloop to defend hundreds of miles of coastline. Into this unstable world sailed Captain Ezekiel Thorne, a man who would redefine what piracy could mean. Born in London around 1675 to a modest merchant family, Thorne had received a gentleman's education before earning a rare post as surgeon's mate in the Royal Navy, an extraordinary achievement for someone without noble blood. Records show he rose swiftly, serving aboard HMS Defiance in the Caribbean and earning promotion to full ship surgeon in just 4 years, a career climb that usually took decades. His commanding officers praised his composure under fire and his surgical brilliance, yet in private letters his colleagues expressed unease. They described his unnerving fascination with wounds and death, how he would linger over the most gruesome cases, sketching the dying and noting their final words with a detachment that chilled fellow officers. One commander even wrote in 1710, young Thorne could be the finest surgeon of his generation. But when he works, there is something in his eyes that chills my blood. He studies suffering the way other men study maps. The true horror began on October 15, 1714, with the attack on Willowbrook Plantation, a rice operation about 20 miles north of Charlestown. Its owner, Samuel Hawthorne, a younger son of English gentry, had invested his inheritance in Carolina rice. He ran the plantation with a dozen indentured Scots and 15 enslaved Africans recently purchased off a slaver. The plantation was laid out like most main house, raised on pilings, against floods quarters for workers' cabins, for the enslaved rice barns, and dikes snaking across the swampy fields. On that autumn morning, the overseer Jonathan Cray hid in the rice granary and lived to tell investigators what he saw. He recalled how the pirates arrived cloaked in fog, but this was no raid like the colony had ever known. There were no cannon shots, no fire, no screams. They came silently, moving like shadows. Thorne, wearing a dark blue naval coat with brass buttons, but no insignia, led them with chilling precision. These were not ragged freebooters, but disciplined men carrying out a deliberate plan. Most unsettling of all, Thorne carried a leather-bound journal, pausing before each captive to study them closely, making notes with the care of a physician. Elderly workers were dismissed. Children under 16 were sent away. Anyone visibly sick or weak was ignored. But healthy men and women between 20 and 40 were examined as though in a clinic. Cray swore. Thorne pressed his ear to their chests, checked their teeth, tapped their joints, made them walk in straight lines, recording every detail with clinical detachment. This was not looting. This was selection. When young Mary Caldwell began to cry, she was barely 18 and had never been more than 10 miles from the plantation. Thorne told her that her tears showed a strong nervous system and calmly jotted additional notes into his journal. From Willowbrook Plantation, 8 people were chosen. Samuel Hawthorne himself, his nephew, Peter the bookkeeper, 2 skilled indentured carpenters, 3 of the younger enslaved workers, and Mary Caldwell, an Irish servant who had arrived only 6 months earlier. They were bound with ropes, but not abused, and were even given water and blankets, as if this were some strange, organized transfer, rather than a pirate raid. Before leaving, Thorne addressed the remaining workers with words that Jonathan Cray swore he would never forget these individuals. He declared would contribute to a cause that would benefit all mankind, advancing human knowledge in ways they could not imagine. If no one interfered, no further harm would come. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, Thorne's men led their captives down to the waiting boats. The entire ordeal had lasted less than 2 hours. What disturbed Cray most was not the loss of his neighbors, but Thorne's demeanor, calm, professional, utterly detached from the terror he had created. 3 days later, the same pattern unfolded at Cedar Point, a fishing village built around a natural harbor. Again, the pirates arrived without a sound, moved through the homes with military precision, and selected only those who matched Thorne's mysterious criteria. 6 were taken among them: James Fairfax, a blacksmith, whose skill and robust health seemed to please Thorne, and Sarah Pemberton, a young mother whose infant was left behind with neighbors when she was deemed suitable. A fisherman named Elias Dunham, who survived by hiding beneath an overturned boat, later testified that Thorne questioned each person about their health, their family history of illness, and their trade. When Fairfax explained he had never once suffered fever or pox, Thorne smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had found exactly what he wanted. The psychological toll on these coastal communities was devastating. Unlike ordinary pirate attacks, which were brutal, but at least understandable in their motives, Thorne's raids seemed inexplicable. Parents began hiding their healthiest children, even encouraging small injuries or feigned sickness to make them appear unfit. Settlements that had survived Indian raids, Spanish incursions, and the harsh realities of frontier life were powerless against an enemy who valued neither gold nor goods, but human lives for reasons beyond comprehension. Over the next 6 weeks, the pattern repeated again and again. Pine Harbor, a lumber camp, lost 5 workers. Marsh Landing, a small port for traders, saw 7 vanish. Cooper's Ford, a busy river crossing, was struck twice with 9 colonists taken in total. Each time the approach was silent, the examinations clinical, and the selection precise. No ransom demands ever came. The pirates seemed uninterested in wealth of any kind. The final known raid came on November 28, 1714 at Haven's Rest, a port where ships replenished water and supplies. Martha Pickering, the tavern keeper's wife, was initially selected only to be released when Thorne discovered she was pregnant with her 3rd child. He pressed her stomach, gently asked detailed questions about her earlier pregnancies, and then told her she was unsuitable for the work. Before letting her go, he delivered a statement that would haunt her for life. "The 42 souls I have gathered," he said, "will help unlock the secrets of life itself. Their sacrifice will benefit all mankind, though they may never see the fruits of their contribution." Martha later described him as a man of about 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to measure and record everything they saw. He spoke not like a pirate, but like a scholar, slipping easily into Latin and medical terminology far beyond her understanding. There was something broken in his voice, as though he had witnessed horrors no Christian man was meant to see. He moved like someone crushed by an unbearable burden, yet convinced that burden served a higher purpose. In the wake of the disappearances, the Carolina colony descended into chaos, unlike anything in its short history. Governor Charles Craven, under pressure from terrified settlers, grieving families, and impatient officials in London, launched the largest maritime search ever attempted in the colony. 3 naval ships were dispatched: HMS Squirrel, a 6th-rate frigate, and the colony's primary defense; HMS Garland, a smaller sloop normally used for patrols; and Carolina Merchant, a hastily converted trading vessel armed with borrowed cannon from Charlestown's fort. To this makeshift fleet were added armed merchantmen, fishing boats, and coastal traders, any ship that could be convinced or forced into service. Rewards were posted for information drawing privateers, hardened pirates and adventurers eager to profit from the crisis. The search quickly uncovered chilling clues. On Kiowa Island, just south of Charlestown, investigators found signs of a large encampment that had housed dozens for several weeks. Cooking fires had been neatly arranged, latrine pits dug with care, and most disturbing of all, crude surgical stations built from driftwood and salvaged timber. Lieutenant William Harrington of the Colonial Militia, who led the Kiowa search, filed a report that stunned the governor. The team had discovered instruments identified as surgical tools, though many bore designs unknown even to physicians trained at the Royal College of Surgeons. There were curved bone saws, an array of forceps sorted by size, and glass vials holding strange residues no one could identify. Even more unsettling were the traces of human habitation. Sleeping areas had been marked with stakes laid out in precise rows. A massive fire pit surrounded by benches arranged in perfect circles suggested gatherings or instruction, and scattered across wooden tables were dark stains later confirmed to be human blood. This was no pirate brawl. This was deliberate, organized medical. In his report, Harrington wrote that the site revealed resources and knowledge far beyond the capacity of common sea rovers. This was not the work of desperate men seeking plunder, but of individuals following a systematic agenda. Similar camps were soon uncovered on John's Island, Folly Island, and several barrier islands between Charlestown and Savannah. Each showed the same disturbing pattern: careful planning, temporary habitation, and what appeared to be field hospitals rather than pirate hideouts. Whoever Thorne commanded, they knew the coastline intimately, and they had prepared multiple staging grounds long before the raids began. But the most alarming discovery came on December 20th, 1714, when a fishing crew near the mouth of the Santee River spotted smoke curling above Gull's Rest Island, a barren stretch of land sailors usually avoided due to its treacherous currents. 3 days later, colonial forces landed and found the island abandoned. But what they uncovered shook them to their core. Captain Henry Morrison of the Colonial Militia, who led the expedition, described Gull's Rest as a temporary medical facility disguised as a camp. Sleeping quarters for at least 60 people were arranged in military rows, each space marked with personal belongings, abandoned in haste. The island bore every sign not of piracy, but of a disciplined operation with a single chilling purpose. At the heart of the camp stood a large fire pit encircled by wooden benches, and before it a rough lectern cobbled together from driftwood and ship timbers. Captain Morrison's report suggested the arrangement had been used for regular gatherings, lectures, planning sessions, or even instruction. But the most disturbing section of the site lay beneath a canvas awning, where rows of wooden tables bore the unmistakable marks of surgical work. Dr. Alexander Whiteside, the expedition's physician, examined the surfaces and confirmed that the cuts and grooves were consistent with bone sawing, deep incisions, and precise anatomical study. Drainage channels had even been carved into the wood to funnel blood away, evidence of deliberate and repeated procedures. The organization of instruments and benches suggested not chaos, but a functioning field laboratory. Even more unsettling were the bundles of notes and drawings discovered buried under one of the wooden frames. Written in Latin and in portions of coded shorthand, they contained anatomical sketches of astonishing detail, coupled with observations decades ahead of anything taught in Europe. Whiteside, the only man in the colony trained to read medical Latin after his studies in Edinburgh, was tasked with translating them. What he uncovered horrified him. The documents described blood circulation with a sophistication that rivaled William Harvey's great work. They charted nervous system responses under varied conditions and outlined surgical techniques that would not formally appear in European medical practice until the mid-1700s. But alongside these insights were passages that revealed their terrible cost references to experimental subjects. notes on controlled stress applications, and coldly written accounts of pain tolerance studies. Whiteside's confidential assessment to Governor Craven was damning. These drawings demonstrate knowledge rivaling the finest physicians of Europe, yet the methods used to acquire it abandon all Christian morality and medical decency. Whoever authored these papers was a master surgeon, but one who had forsaken any concern for human welfare. Faced with undeniable evidence of systematic human experimentation, but no living perpetrators to prosecute, the colonial government made a choice that would shape history. The files were classified under colonial security. The families of the missing were told their loved ones had likely drowned in a shipwreck, and the physical evidence was either destroyed or shipped to secure vaults in London. Officials argued the cover-up was necessary to prevent panic and discourage imitators, but it also served to shield the colony's leadership from accusations of failure and negligence. Despite official silence, rumors spread like wildfire along the coast. Fishermen spoke of strange lights on barrier islands, patterns too deliberate to be campfires. Captains told of abandoned beaches with signs of recent work fires, still warm tools left behind, but no people. A picture emerged of an organization still active, shifting its bases to evade discovery. The implication was terrifying. Either Thorne himself had survived the search, or his knowledge had passed into other hands, just as ruthless and determined. The mystery widened to international waters in the spring of 1715. The Spanish trading ship Santa Catalina limped into Charlestown Harbor, battered and scarred from an encounter unlike any her captain had seen in 3 decades at sea. Captain Diego Velasquez, hardened by years of battling English, French, and Dutch pirates, described through his translator a raid that defied all understanding of piracy. They intercepted us 3 leagues south of the Florida coast. Velasquez told colonial authorities, and what we witnessed was not piracy as the world has ever known. They did not fire a shot, did not demand surrender, did not storm the deck with cutlasses and pistols. Instead, the English captain approached under a flag of truce and requested permission to board, claiming he wished only to examine the crew for disease and provide medical aid if necessary. Captain Velasquez's description of this man matched perfectly with the accounts from Carolina survivors, about 40 years of age, educated and precise, dressed in naval fashion, though without insignia, carrying a leather-bound journal, and obsessed with examination rather than plunder. At first, Velasquez had refused the bizarre request. But when several sailors collapsed with the telltale fever and black vomit of Yellow Jack desperation, overcame suspicion. "My men were dying," Velasquez explained. "I had no physician, no medicines. When the Englishmen offered to treat them in return for the right to study their condition, I felt I had no choice but to accept." What followed was unlike anything in the annals of piracy. Thorne boarded the Santa Catalina with several assistance men who, to Velasquez's astonishment, appeared to be former captives now serving him willingly. They examined the sick with disciplined precision, recording notes, sketching symptoms in detail, and assisting in procedures with the practiced efficiency of trained medical staff. Thorne himself displayed knowledge that astounded even veteran sailors. He diagnosed illnesses, correctly prescribed strange remedies unknown to Spanish medicine, and performed surgical procedures that seemed nothing short of miraculous. Within days, men on the brink of death were walking the decks fully recovered. Yet the most disturbing revelation came not from Thorne, but from one of his assistants. A young man, with the bearing of a gentleman, confided in Velasquez in whispered Spanish. He identified himself as Thomas Peaton, son of a Carolina shipwright known to have vanished in the October raids. Speaking quietly and with conviction, Peaton explained that he and others had at first resisted, but had come to accept the greater purpose of their captivity. "We are part of a great medical undertaking," he told the Spanish captain. "Our work will save countless lives. The captain's knowledge will change the future." Velasquez was shaken. Were these men brainwashed, coerced, or had they truly come to revere Thorne? The thought that kidnapped colonists could be transformed into willing disciples of their captor was as terrifying as the raids themselves. Before departing, Thorne left behind a chest of medicines, claiming they would prevent future outbreaks of fever. To Velasquez's astonishment, they worked better than anything he had seen in 30 years of sailing the Caribbean. But the gift of health came at a terrible price. The sight of good Christian men remade into servants of a man whose ambitions bordered on madness. Crew members corroborated their captain's testimony, adding more unsettling detail. They reported that Thorne's ship, a converted English galleon, had been heavily modified. Through open ports, Spanish sailors glimpsed not hammocks and plunder, but orderly rows of bunks, surgical equipment gleaming in lamplight, and even a library of medical texts. It was not a pirate ship. It was a floating hospital, a laboratory at sea. Colonial investigators, led by Judge Samuel Richardson, began piecing together the fragments. The evidence suggested that Thorne had not vanished after the November raids at all. Instead, he had built a mobile operation, carrying his dark experiments from island to island, spreading fear and leaving behind stories that blurred the line between miracle and monstrosity. Throughout 1715, scattered reports from the southeastern coast and Caribbean ports built a disturbing pattern. A British merchant captain swore he encountered a vessel near Nassau, matching the description of the so-called anatomist. Its commander requested permission to examine crew members suffering from dysentery, offering, in return, medicines so effective they bordered on miraculous, along with promises of protection from disease. A French privateer claimed English-speaking pirates had approached him with an even stranger offer: advanced medical knowledge in exchange for intelligence about Spanish treasure fleets. Most unsettling of all testimonies collected in Jamaican colonial archives told of men who identified themselves as former Carolina colonists. They spoke not of chains or brutality, but of medical research they claimed would transform mankind's understanding of life and death itself. The emerging picture was that of a floating hospital, a laboratory protected by armed escorts and manned by a strange coalition of willing converts and unwilling assistants. But the most haunting questions remained unanswered. What became of those who refused to cooperate? How did Thorne bend captives into loyal participants, and what discoveries were worth such cruelty? Some answers came from an unexpected source: the private letters of Dr. James Peaton, a Scottish physician working in Jamaica. His correspondence with Dr. William MacLeod at the Royal College of Surgeons, discovered during renovations of the Edinburgh Library in 1923, provides the most detailed contemporary record of Thorne's experiments. In his first letter, dated December 15, 1715, Peaton wrote, "I have this week treated 3 individuals who claim to be subjects of medical experimentation conducted aboard pirate vessels. Their stories are almost too terrible to believe. Yet the scars on their bodies and their remarkable physical condition bear evidence of surgical interventions beyond the reach of civilized medicine." He described operations that should have killed patients outright. Yet not only had they survived, they exhibited abilities that seemed almost enhanced. According to these survivors, the anatomist was a converted galleon meticulously refitted into something more like a military hospital than a pirate ship. Its decks were reorganized into surgical suites. Recovery wards lined with neat rows of beds, isolation chambers for infectious cases, and even crude laboratories where medicines were prepared and tested. Lighting and ventilation had been engineered with precision, and instruments were stored in systematic order. The ship was not the work of desperate marauders, but the product of careful planning resources and knowledge rivaling Europe's most advanced medical centers. But what chilled Peaton most was not the facilities. It was the system Thorn had devised to control his captives. Physical force and threats alone could never have maintained order. Instead, Thorn used medicine itself as both carrot and stick. Comprehensive examinations identified hidden illnesses, chronic injuries, and disabilities. Those who cooperated were rewarded with treatments that bordered on the miraculous. Piton described one man who had lived with a withered arm since birth, useless for labor. Yet under Thorn's knife, the arm had been restored to full strength and function. The surgical scars were undeniable, and the man spoke of his experience with a mixture of terror and gratitude so unsettling that Piton himself admitted he did not know how to classify it. In case after case, survivors reported the same process. Pain that had lingered for years was erased. Fevers and chronic diseases were cured with unknown medicines. Old wounds were repaired with techniques that should not have existed. And through this cycle of suffering and healing, captives began to form an unnatural loyalty to the very man who had stolen them from their homes. Dr. James Piton's letters grew darker with each passing month. At first he wrote of miraculous cures, patients relieved of consumption-damaged organs, repaired conditions once deemed incurable, treated with surgical precision that surpassed anything he had ever seen during his training. What staggered him most was that these operations were not conducted in Europe's finest hospitals, but aboard a ship at sea under field conditions that should have made such feats impossible. Yet Piton also documented the other side of Thorn's methods, the punishments reserved for those who refused to cooperate or who attempted escape. He examined former captives who bore the scars of surgeries designed not to heal, but to cripple. One case in particular haunted him, a young woman who had tried to flee during the ship's first month of operation. Thorn had silenced her by surgically damaging her vocal cords so precisely that she would never speak above a whisper again. She lived but as a permanent warning to the others. By 1715, the anatomist no longer carried just the original 42 Carolina colonists. Piton's correspondence makes clear that Thorn's floating laboratory now held more than 100 subjects of varied nationalities and backgrounds, each selected for specific traits to serve his research. Spaniards were used in studies on resistance to tropical disease. French prisoners became material for battlefield surgical experiments. Africans purchased from slavers were forced into trials of endurance and pain tolerance. Every group served a purpose. What emerged was nothing less than a systematic program of human experimentation, rivaling the scope of Europe's greatest medical institutions. Piton's letters describe the anatomist as a place of chilling order. Subjects were divided into groups based on their health and assigned roles in ongoing research. Those undergoing treatment received generous food and care to ensure recovery, while others, those being tested, were kept in controlled conditions to maximize the value of the data. It was medicine reduced to pure calculation, where human beings were no more than material. Then, in early 1716, the story took a turn that made even Piton question his own soul. He confessed that he had been approached in Kingston by a well-dressed envoy of Thorn's organization. The man carried an invitation. If Piton agreed to join them, he would gain access to medical knowledge that could transform the world. Organ transplants, surgical repairs of spinal injuries, treatments for mental illness, medicines that could extend human life far beyond natural limits. In a letter dated February 1716, Piton poured out his torment to his colleague in Edinburgh. I am presented with an opportunity that challenges every principle of medical ethics I have sworn to uphold. These men offer discoveries that could save thousands, perhaps millions of lives. Yet their methods require the systematic sacrifice of unwilling subjects. To accept may damn my soul. To refuse may deny mankind its greatest salvation. The envoy then showed him proof anatomical drawings of breathtaking precision surgical instruments, unlike anything Piton had ever seen. and most compelling of all living examples of Thorne's success. One was a man born blind who now claimed to see. Peyton examined his eyes and found evidence of surgical reconstruction, healthy tissue replacing what had once been ruined. The precision was beyond anything in known medical science. The result was undeniable. Peyton's last surviving letter is dated March 10, 1716. In it, he describes the blind man's restored vision with awe and dread in equal measure. Then his correspondence ceases abruptly. Colonial records note that he vanished from Kingston soon after leaving behind his medical practice, his equipment, and even a fortune in his banking accounts. It was as if he had been plucked from his life overnight. The implication was unmistakable. Thorne's organization had begun recruiting physicians, expanding its reach beyond kidnapped colonists and coerced assistants. They were building something larger, a network of knowledge and practitioners that legitimate medicine would not match for decades, even centuries. Thorne's recruitment efforts targeted ambitious young physicians, men willing to overlook questions of morality in exchange for discoveries that promised to rewrite the boundaries of medicine. But the most haunting revelation surfaced decades later, hidden in the spine of one of Dr. Peyton's medical texts. When the book was rebound during an estate sale in 1876, a folded sheet of ciphered notes was discovered. It would not be decoded until the 1940s, when wartime cryptographers finally unraveled its message. What it revealed shook even hardened codebreakers. He has learned to extend life far beyond natural limits, the letter read. But the cost in human suffering defies comprehension. Those who survive his final procedures are changed in ways that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. I fear we have created something that should never have been allowed to exist. Some discoveries are too dangerous, some prices too high, even in the name of science. If I do not return from this voyage, let it be known that mankind is better off without this knowledge. The final chapter of Captain Ezekiel Thorne's story emerged not through archives or naval reports, but through a deathbed confession. In the winter of 1718, at the monastery of San Cristobal in Cuba, Father Miguel Santos recorded the testimony of a broken man known to the monks as El Cirujano Inglés, the English surgeon. He had stumbled into the monastery 3 years earlier, gaunt and shattered, muttering fragments of English and Latin. Santos, a scholar trained at the University of Salamanca, before taking his vows cared for him and meticulously preserved his notes. The man's body bore scars that testified to years of self-experimentation. His hands had been reshaped, the fingers unnaturally sensitive, his joints altered to allow an eerie precision and flexibility. Some procedures had succeeded in enhancing his dexterity, others had left grotesque damage. This man had clearly been both surgeon and subject, Father Santos wrote. His body was a battlefield between genius and madness. For years, the patient drifted in incoherence, muttering of captain's subjects and procedures beyond imagining. But as death closed in his mind, cleared. In Latin, he confessed his identity. He was Dr. James Peyton, the Scottish physician who had vanished from Kingston in 1716. And he carried with him the final truth about Captain Thorne and the fate of the 42 colonists. Peyton's confession described a ship transformed into a floating chamber of horrors. What began as research had grown into systematic torture cloaked in the language of science. By 1717, more than 200 captives filled the Anatomist. The original Carolina colonists had been only the first layer in an ever-expanding human experiment. Thorne's breakthroughs were undeniable. He had learned to keep patients alive through surgeries that should have killed them. He repaired and even enhanced failing organs, using tissue taken from others. He extended life far beyond natural limits, but only through the systematic destruction of other human beings. The ship itself had been divided into specialized wards, each dedicated to a branch of his monstrous program. One section pushed human endurance to the breaking point. Subjects starved, frozen, or overheated while their responses were charted with scientific precision. Another tested new surgical instruments and procedures, most of them fatal, but each carefully documented. And the most dreadful of all was the section Thorn called enhancement. Here captives chosen for strength, speed, or intelligence were cut, altered, and treated with strange chemicals in an attempt to create improved humans. Beings with sharper senses, greater strength, heightened reflexes, even expanded mental capacity. It was this work, Piton confessed, that shattered whatever remained of his loyalty. For in these experiments, he saw not healing, but the deliberate remaking of humanity itself. "We created abominations," Piton confessed, his failing voice recorded by Father Santos. Men whose strength had been amplified beyond human limits, but whose sanity had been shattered in the process. Women whose senses were heightened until ordinary light and sound became unbearable torments. Children forced into grotesque maturity, their bodies aging years in mere months, while their minds remained frozen in innocence. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ezekiel Thorn, no longer the brilliant surgeon he had once been. Through relentless self-experimentation, aided by his followers, he had reshaped himself into something neither fully man nor fully natural. His body was stronger, his mind sharper, his senses uncanny. But in Piton's words, superhuman, yet fundamentally wrong. His humanity had been consumed by obsession. He no longer saw captives as people, but as collections of organs and systems to be harvested in service of his vision. His dream was nothing less than a new kind of humanity, perfected, enhanced, eternal. What he created instead were nightmares. The climax of his madness came with his final experiment, the pursuit of immortality. By early 1717, Thorn's body, ravaged by decades of surgery and chemicals, had begun to fail. Obsessed with preserving his knowledge, he devised a procedure that would transfer his memories, his very consciousness, into a younger, healthier vessel, chosen from his captives. For months, the crew prepared refining techniques that promised not just to transplant organs, but to move the essence of a soul. One calm night in a hidden lagoon, the operation began. By dawn, it had ended in horror. Both Thorn and his intended host lay on the surgical table, but they were no longer two men. Their bodies had fused into a grotesque hybrid, sharing features of both, yet belonging to neither. They lived but only barely conscious, aware and raving with fragments of Thorn's mind. It was not life preserved, but madness given form. Even Thorn's most loyal disciples could not stomach what they saw. The enhanced assistants, the converted colonists, even the physicians who had aided him, all recognized that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The rebellion was swift. With precision equal to the research, they now sought to erase the survivors, destroyed the anatomist. They freed what captives could survive, granted merciful deaths to those whose bodies had been twisted beyond repair, and consigned the rest to the sea. Piton's words were chilling in their clarity. We realized we had become accomplices in a crime against the natural order itself. The captain's final experiment proved that his path led not to the betterment of humanity, but to its ruin. His knowledge could not be allowed to endure. For 3 days they worked systematically. Journals, instruments, preserved specimens, all the records of 3 years of research were destroyed. Books and notes were burned. Surgical tools and specimens were cast into the deep. Every trace of Thorn's work was eliminated. Even those of us who had benefited from his procedures agreed, Piton confessed. The knowledge was too dangerous to survive. Some discoveries the survivors realized are too terrible for humanity to possess. The floating laboratory was scuttled in deep waters off the Cuban coast, its timbers shattered, and its hull holed in dozens of places, carrying the last physical traces of Thorne's work into the abyss. The survivors scattered, many broken in mind, others consumed by guilt, and a few determined to ensure the captain's knowledge would die with them. Some, like Dr. James Peaton himself, sought refuge in monasteries, clinging to the hope that faith might wash away their complicity in horrors beyond comprehension. His confession ended with a final warning. "We thought we were advancing human understanding, pushing the boundaries of science for the benefit of mankind. But some boundaries exist for good reason. There are limits to what humans should know, and costs too great, no matter the promise of discovery." Peaton died on December 25, 1718. His last words, a prayer for forgiveness, not for himself alone, but for the souls of all who had suffered in service to Thorne's ambition. He was buried in an unmarked grave at San Cristobal, his request for anonymity honored by the monks who had sheltered him. The puzzle might have ended there, sealed in obscurity, if not for a remarkable discovery 2 centuries later. In 1923, workmen repairing a damaged wall at the Cuban monastery uncovered a hidden chamber sealed by Father Santos before his death in 1742. Inside lay an archive of preserved documents. Peaton's complete confession, additional testimonies from other survivors, and the journals of priests who had quietly safeguarded these records for generations. Among them was the account of William Hartwell, a ship's carpenter who described in harrowing detail the systematic destruction of the anatomist. "We worked for 3 days and nights to ensure that every trace of the captain's work was eliminated," he wrote in 1729. "The instruments were chained and cast into the deepest waters. The books were burned to ash and scattered to the wind. The ship itself was pierced in dozens of places and sent to the bottom where no man could find it again." Another testimony, written in 1731 by a woman identified only as Maria S., provided a rare perspective as one of Thorne's female subjects. Her account, recorded in Spanish, described procedures designed to test human endurance and the psychological effects of experimental compounds. She spoke of chemicals that heightened the senses to unbearable levels and treatments that left subjects caught between lucidity and madness. These hidden archives came under study in 1924 by Dr. Edmund Hartwell of the Smithsonian Institution. His private analysis, published in a limited edition the following year, concluded that the testimonies revealed a level of systematic human experimentation unparalleled in its time, predating similar work in Europe by decades. Yet he acknowledged that the lack of physical evidence made definitive proof elusive, and so the story of Thorne remained balanced between documented horror and whispered legend. The fate of the original 42 Carolina colonists was partially confirmed in the 1930s when the Colonial Historical Society uncovered falsified death records. Official documents had attributed their ends to shipwrecks during escape attempts, but genealogical traces revealed inconsistencies. More disturbingly, burial records from Caribbean islands told of unmarked graves, often for individuals with surgical scars of unusual design. A Jamaican cemetery keeper, writing in 1745, noted several burials of men and women who spoke deliriously of experiments aboard English ships before their deaths. The story of Captain Ezekiel Thorne thus lived on, half buried in official silence, half resurrected by whispers and fragments. His quest to perfect human life had instead created a legacy of suffering, secrecy, and fear. And his name passed into legend not as a healer, but as a warning that knowledge without morality is a road that leads only to ruin. The scattered references, though never providing absolute proof, painted a hauntingly consistent picture: survivors and victims of Thorne's experiments scattered across the Caribbean, their lives cloaked in silence, shame, and fear. Monastery records revealed that fragments of Thorne's forbidden knowledge had not died with him. Some of his assistants, burdened by guilt yet unwilling to abandon the skills they had acquired, set up small practices in remote corners of the Caribbean. One such figure, remembered only as the Dutch doctor, ran a quiet clinic on the island of Curaçao from 1720 until his death in 1754. Local accounts describe miraculous cures and surgical procedures decades ahead of their time, performed by a physician who never spoke of his training or past. Similar whispers surfaced from other islands, stories of hidden doctors with uncanny skill, men and women who healed but lived in constant fear that their abilities would expose the terrible source of their knowledge. The last confirmed trace of Thorne's legacy came in 1756, when a dying man in Port Royal, Jamaica, confessed to a priest that he had once lived aboard the floating hospital. He gave his name as Thomas Peaton Jr., claiming to be the son of the Carolina shipwright taken in the original raids. His testimony, preserved in parish records, confirmed that 4 of the original colonists had survived the ship's destruction. But they had sworn never to reveal the truth or attempt to return to their old lives. By 1760, all references ceased. Whatever remained of Thorne's network knowledge or disciples vanished into silence. The knowledge they carried represented both a terrible loss and a necessary sacrifice. Techniques that might have cured the incurable, extended life or repaired the broken were destroyed alongside the memory of the horrors that had birthed them. The 42 colonists stolen in 1714 became unwilling martyrs to science gone mad. Their suffering erased from the official record until monastery archives forced the truth into the light centuries later. This story reminds us of an eternal question. How far should humanity go in the pursuit of knowledge? Could Thorne's discoveries, organ transplants restored, vision cures for disease ever justify the torment inflicted to achieve them? Or are there boundaries we should never cross, no matter the promise of progress? The graves scattered across the Caribbean, the falsified death records in Carolina, and the testimonies hidden in monastic vaults all whisper the same warning that progress without morality leads only to ruin. Captain Ezekiel Thorne's transformation from healer to monster stands as a chilling reminder that knowledge without compassion is as dangerous as ignorance itself. So what do you think? Could discoveries of such magnitude ever excuse the cost in human suffering? Or must there always be a line, one that science, no matter how ambitious, should never cross? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dark chapter of American maritime history as unsettling as I did, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the forgotten corners of our past. Join me next time as we uncover another hidden truth from the shadows of history.